All right, so you want to go deep on Matthew 6, 9 to 13. Want to take your next sermon to the next level.
Well, you came to the right place.
We've got a whole stack of sermons here from different churches, pastors going all out on the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah, it's really amazing.
It's amazing how many different approaches there are.
Or to this one passage, yeah.
And we're talking fresh insights, not the typical Sunday school stuff.
Ah, moments.
Exactly. The kind of stuff that'll have your congregation thinking, whoa, I've never thought about it like that before.
What we're aiming for, right?
Absolutely. So let's jump right in. One thing that really stood out to me from these sermons, the word Jesus uses for father. It's not just any old father. It's Abba.
Yeah, Abba. And that one word, just that one word changes everything.
Like, what does that even mean?
So in Jesus' time calling God Abba, it was incredibly intimate.
Like, really intimate.
Almost like saying daddy. It completely reframes how we see God. Like, it's not this distant king anymore.
Suddenly we're invited into this close personal relationship.
Exactly. We're not just bowing before a sovereign.
We're approaching a loving father.
Right.
I mean, can you imagine what that must have been like for the people hearing Jesus say that for the first time?
Oh, it was revolutionary. And it really sets the tone for how a lot of these pastors approached prayer in general.
Yeah, it's not about just, like, rattling off a wish list, right?
No, not at all. Forget the divine vending machine.
It's about this deeper connection, aligning your will with God's.
It's a lifelong commitment.
Having that dynamic conversation, yeah. One sermon even called it the yoke of the kingdom.
Yeah, I saw that one.
Accepting God's rule is a form of prayer in itself. That's deep.
It really is. It makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah, because we usually think of prayer as something we do, not something we surrender to.
That's right. It's about yielding, even when it's hard.
Now, here's where things get really interesting. A lot of these sermons emphasize that truly grasping God's holiness should change how we pray.
Radically change it, yeah.
Like, are we even conveying that sense of awe and reverence when we talk about prayer?
It's a good question. Have we become too casual?
One pastor even brought up the Jewish tradition of not saying God's name aloud, out of respect.
Right.
And then there's this incredible illustration from the sermon at Parkview Christian Church. They connect "Hallowed be your name" straight back to Isaiah's vision of God's holiness.
Oh, wow.
Remember Isaiah's reaction?
Completely undone.
Overwhelmed by his own unworthiness.
Right.
It's a good reminder that we're not dealing with some cosmic buddy here.
Right.
This is the creator of the universe, holy and powerful, Okay, now I have to share this because it's such a cool idea. Chatham Community Church, they introduced this prayer triangle concept.
I love this one.
It starts with Father, goes to hallowed be your name, then your kingdom come. And they use it to anchor even the most audacious prayers in those foundational truths.
It's brilliant because it's so easy to get caught up in our own wants,
Right, but this triangle forces you to start with God, His holiness,
and His kingdom.
before you even think about your own requests. And suddenly, those bold move mountains prayers, they become expressions of faith, not just wishful thinking.
Exactly. You're aligning your desires with God's will even when you're praying for the impossible.
Now, you know I love a good sermon illustration, and these pastors did not disappoint.
Oh, they were creative.
This one pastor compared daily prayer to recharging your phone.
Okay, yeah, I saw that one.
Dead battery, panic. Same with neglecting your connection to God.
It's simple, but it really gets the point across.
We're so dependent on our phones, right?
Mm,
Maybe that can help us understand our need for that constant connection with God.
I think so.
Another one used this light switch analogy for tapping into God's power.
I love the light switch.
Simple, right? Flip the switch, power flows. Connect with God through prayer. His power flows into your life.
I like that.
But for a really powerful illustration, you have to check out South Lake Nazarene's sermon. They told the story of Dr. Kent Brantley.
The doctor who got Ebola.
Yes.
Wow, I remember that.
And the pastor highlighted how Dr. Brantley's prayers during that time perfectly reflected the Lord's Prayer.
Wow, what an example.
Talk about faith in action. His prayers weren't about escaping the suffering or demanding a miracle.
They were about surrender.
Yeah, finding strength and peace in the middle of a storm. And that's what's so powerful about the Lord's Prayer. It's not some magic formula. It's a way to connect with God in our humanity.
In our joy and our suffering.
Speaking of powerful connections, one sermon linked, "Give us this day our daily bread," to forgiveness.
Now, that's an interesting connection.
I know, right? Like, what does bread have to do with forgiveness?
Well, they argue it's not just about physical bread, but that spiritual sustenance we need from Jesus.
Daily bread.
Yeah, that daily infusion of grace. And it's that, they argue, that empowers us to forgive others.
So without that daily bread, that connection with Christ, we don't have the strength to let go of those hurts.
We become spiritually malnourished.
And they tie it back to the Israelites in the wilderness, Yeah, that daily dependence on God.
It's a good parallel.
Powerful reminder that forgiveness isn't a one-time thing. It's a daily choice.
It's reliance on God's grace.
So we've talked about a lot, approaching God as Abba, aligning our will with His, recognizing His holiness.
Yeah, there's so much to uncover here.
But there's one phrase that always seems to spark a lot of debate.
Leads us not into temptation.
Yeah, that one. What jumped out at you from these sermons about that?
Well, at the Father's House sermon, they really went deep on the original Greek word.
Okay, let's get into the Greek.
It's parasmos, and it doesn't just mean temptation, like, being lured into sin.
It doesn't.
It can also mean testing or trial.
So how does that change things?
Well, it suggests that God might actually allow us to go through difficult times.
Not to make us sin.
No, but to refine us, to make us stronger.
So, it's not about tripping us up.
Right. More like a coach pushing you to your limits.
Not someone tried to sabotage you.
Yeah. Exactly. God wants us to be resilient, and sometimes that means facing tough stuff.
And it's in those times that we really learn to rely on Him.
Yeah, not on ourselves.
That's a message that'll definitely resonate with people. We all go through those seasons where we feel tested, tempted to give up.
Absolutely.
But maybe those trials are opportunities.
A chance to grow closer to God.
To lean into His power. And that brings us back to, remember that sermon that connected daily bread and forgiveness?
Yeah. How could I forget?
How do those even relate?
Well, Limitless Church California, they had a take on that Jesus is the bread of life.
Okay.
And that daily feeding on His word and grace, that's what empowers us to forgive.
So without that daily bread, that spiritual food, we don't have the strength to forgive.
We just don't.
It's like we're running on empty.
Exactly.
And they tied this back to, the Israelites, manna in the wilderness.
That daily dependence on God.
Right. Forgiveness, it's not a one-time thing, it's a daily thing.
And speaking of Limitless Church California, they had some really incredible illustrations.
Oh, yeah. I'm always on the lookout for good illustrations.
Well, one that really stood out was they used the animated movie Wild Robot.
Wild Robot?
Yeah, they talked about how the robot, through her journey, she learns to own up to her mistakes.
To seek healing.
Reconciliation,
Oh.
yeah. And it's a beautiful analogy for confession.
And for seeking forgiveness, yeah.
Through Jesus.
It's amazing how you can find these spiritual truths in the most unexpected places. What other illustrations did they use?
Well, to show how sometimes we're our own worst enemies, not, some external force, they used a meme.
A meme.
It was one of those devil on vacation memes.
Okay, that's awesome.
Implying we cause our own problems sometimes.
I love that. Humor and a serious point, all in one.
Right. It's a good reminder. Spiritual warfare is real, but we also have to take responsibility.
Yeah, we can't always blame the devil for everything. Okay, I'm totally stealing that one. Did they have any other illustrations?
One more. And it was a powerful one. They talked about Nelson Mandela.
Mandela, wow.
As an example of forgiveness. How he invited his prison guard to his inauguration.
Amazing.
And he even had tea with the widow of the architect of apartheid.
That's letting go of bitterness.
Seeing the humanity in someone who hurt you, it's challenging, isn't it?
To strive for that.
To forgive like that.
Absolutely. And it shows that the Lord's Prayer, it's not just words.
It's a call to action.
To live differently, to love differently, to forgive differently.
And these sermons, they show us that even a passage as familiar as this,
it can still have surprises.
And deep insights. It's a reminder that there's always more to learn.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion.
That's a good way to put it. And it's what makes studying the Bible so exciting.
Because it's alive.
It speaks to us in new ways.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. God as Abba, aligning our will, daily bread and forgiveness.
We have.
But there's one key aspect of the Lord's Prayer we haven't talked about yet.
It's interesting. A lot of these sermons, they emphasize how praying the Lord's Prayer, it's not about changing God's mind.
It's about changing us.
Yeah, it's not like we're twisting His arm to get what we want.
It's about getting our hearts in line with His will.
Right. A lot of pastors use the analogy of a compass.
Okay.
The Lord's Prayer, it's like it reorients us.
Make sure we're heading in the right direction.
And that direction is always toward God's kingdom.
His will being done, which, let's face it, can be a pretty radical idea these days.
It really is.
It's so easy to get caught up in our own little worlds,
Absolutely. Our own desires.
our own agendas. And that's why the Lord's Prayer is so important. It's this constant reminder
Shift our focus
from us to God.
from our kingdom to His.
Speaking of shifting focus, I was really struck by the sermon from Collective Church, the one on gratitude.
Oh, yes, that was a good one. They had this really interesting take on how acknowledging God's holiness
And His kingdom, right at the start.
right at the beginning of the prayer, it leads naturally to being thankful.
To gratitude.
Yeah, and they didn't just stop at the spiritual benefits either.
No, they brought in the science.
The science of gratitude, they talked about studies showing how it improves our well-being.
Mental, physical, emotional, the whole package.
Amazing, isn't it?
It's like this simple act of saying thank you. It can have such a huge impact.
Changes us from the inside out.
It's like a ripple effect.
I like that, a ripple effect.
Gratitude changes us, and then that spills over into everything.
Our relationships, our work, everything.
Our whole outlook on life.
And that, I think, is really the ultimate goal of the Lord's Prayer, to transform us.
To make us more like Christ,
It's not just saying the words, it's living them.
embodying them in everything we do.
It's a challenge, a real challenge.
It's a lifelong journey, that's for sure. But hopefully, this deep dive, all these different sermons,
It's given you some food for thought.
some fresh ideas to bring back to your congregation.
I think so. It's been amazing to see how this prayer, we've heard it so many times,
It can still surprise us
still challenge us.
and ultimately draw us closer to God.
Yeah, that's the point, isn't it?
So as you're preparing your next sermon, your next Bible study on Matthew 6, 9 to 13, I want you to think about this. What would it look like to really live out the Lord's Prayer?
In your own life, in your community.
How can you help your people, your congregation, to see this passage with new eyes?
To experience its power.
We've just scratched the surface here, but hopefully this has given you a fresh perspective on this timeless prayer.
I think it has.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.